Good evening, and thank you for the opportunity to give my presentation via the internet. With that being said, I would like to proceed now. My presentation is on the resignation and scandals involving HP CEO Mark Hurd. Good evening, classmates, and good evening, Mr. Konjerski. Thank you very much for allowing me to give my presentation in this manner. The topic of my presentation tonight is the resignation of HP CEO Mark Hurd. A fascinating example of the importance of ethical business practice, or more appropriately the impact of unethical business practice, is the recent story of the forced resignation of Hewlett-Packard's CEO and chairman of the board. After 5 years as head of the computer company, CEO and chairman Mark Hurd stepped down on August 6, 2010 in the midst of allegations of sexual assault and misuse of company funds. Interestingly enough, Mark Hurd was hired in 2005 as the supposed safe choice to replace more controversial Carly Fiorina. He was even referred to by one board member as the anti-Carly and low-key and humble. Immediately upon taking over as CEO and chairman of the board, Hurd found HP embroiled in a spying controversy in which members of the board and the press had been spied on by private investigators hired by HP to look into the source of information leaks to the press. Chairwoman Patricia Dunn was blamed for the secretive internal investigation, and she resigned immediately. But there has been speculation that Hurd had conspired against Dunn in an effort to take any potential spotlight off of himself. If such speculation is in fact true, it would be a serious early sign of egregious behavior by the person who was supposed to lead the company back to the golden years and the ways of the HP way. A question worth asking in our review of corporate ethical standards and corporate culture is whether or not a CEO should be allowed to escape such controversies without any negative effects. In the case of Mark Hurd, here is a CEO who was awarded annual compensation in excess of $25 million each year that he headed the company. Should someone who was so richly rewarded for their oversight of a corporation not be held accountable when controversies such as this occur under their watch? It would seem that with shareholders standing to lose so much in a controversial situation like this, the board of directors and the shareholders themselves should see to it that the CEO is held at least partially responsible for the questionable and or unethical decisions made by executives within the company. On June 29th, Hewlett-Packard received a letter from attorney Gloria Allred, who was representing an employee of a former HP marketing contractor accusing Mr. Hurd of sexual assault. HP's board of directors launched an inquiry into the allegations, and while they determined that Mr. Hurd had not been in violation of the sexual harassment policy, it was discovered that he had submitted bogus expense reports, which the company believed were falsified in an effort to hide his relationship with the contractor. There are several points of interest in the board's findings. First, the fact that Mr. Hurd was determined to have not been in violation of the sexual harassment policy is a prime example of one of the points that our textbook makes. Ethical responsibility does not merely mean compliance with the law. In fact, there are often times when a person acts well within the bounds of the law, or in this case within policy of an employer, but yet does not meet the moral or ethical values expected by society as a whole. Now, when I mention society as a whole, it is important to realize that this is an example of ethical relativism, because these same acts may not be construed as unethical when viewed within the constructs of another culture or religion. Our textbook states that relativism represents a serious challenge to ethics, including business ethics, because if it is correct, there is no reason to continue our study of ethics. If all opinions are equally valid, then it makes little sense for us to attempt to evaluate ethical judgments in business. This obviously does not so much present itself in a classroom setting such as ours, but when you begin to analyze issues in the context of different societies, cultures, or religions, then you can see how the viewpoints could easily change. Mr. Hurd did eventually reach a settlement with the woman who made the sexual allegations, but the terms of the settlement were not released. Upon announcing his resignation, Mr. Hurd is quoted as saying, "As the investigation progressed, I realized there were instances in which I did not live up to the standards and principles of trust, respect, and integrity that I espoused at HP and which have guided me throughout my career. I believe it would be difficult for me to continue as an effective leader at HP." As part of his agreement to step down, Mr. Hurd was granted a severance package worth $12.2 million in payments plus millions more in stock holdings. Interestingly enough, I began my research with the intent to focus on the alleged unethical actions of Mark Hurd, but I would instead like to focus on several points that I believe are more interesting to consider and more challenging to analyze. First, it is my understanding that when viewed from a deontologist perspective, there would essentially be no alternative but to let Mr. Hurd go because of the falsification of the expense reports. With that being said, I believe it could also be argued from the utilitarianism perspective that Mr. Hurd's actions, while questionable in taste, would not warrant his removal from his post as CEO and chairman. One could argue that the greater good of the employees, shareholders, and end users of HP's products stand to lose more from his resignation than from the already resolved allegations against Mr. Hurd. The company's stock fell almost 10% immediately upon word of the CEO's resignation, and the company paid him many millions of dollars in severance. Ultimately, the total amount of the alleged falsified expense reports totaled only about $20,000, which in the scheme of things is a very small price to be paid by a $115 billion company such as HP. This utilitarianism perspective seems to be backed by a current lawsuit that has been filed by a group of HP shareholders seeking unspecified damages and drastic changes to HP's corporate governance. The lawsuit claims that HP lost significant credibility due to the controversy surrounding Mr. Hurd's resignation. The lawsuit also claims that the percentage of market share that was lost and the severance package that was paid out to Mr. Hurd could have been significantly reduced if the company's board had fired him for cause rather than allowing him to submit his resignation. While it is clear that the shareholders who filed the suit believe that Mr. Hurd's actions were unethical and worthy of firing, it should also be noted that the plaintiffs are pointing to the negative effect that his situation had on the company and shareholders alike. So from a utilitarian perspective, the actions of Mr. Hurd and ultimately the board of the HP directors had a significant negative effect on the company and therefore cannot be construed as catering to the greater good. Now obviously it could also be argued that to overlook such indiscretions would only lead to greater issues in the future, whether from Mr. Hurd's further behavior or from a type of ripple effect that could potentially infect the entire culture of the company. It could be very costly for a company to risk a sort of trickle-down effect occurring where executives are seen to no longer be upholding the intended ethical values of a company. Corporate ethics cannot be practiced by some members of an organization while being ignored by others. There's a high likelihood that the overlooking of one executive's misgivings would quickly lead to diminished ethical standards throughout the organization. On Monday, September 6th, this story took an interesting turn when Larry Ellison, the CEO of Oracle, announced the hiring of Mark Hurd as a president and director of the Hewlett-Packard competitor. This could possibly be perceived by some as a risky move on the part of Oracle to hire someone who so recently was embattled in sexual harassment and fraud accusations. Once again, though, I could see where it could be argued from a utilitarianism perspective that the minor risk involved with such a hire would be outweighed by the potential benefits of hiring an executive that more than tripled profits in his previous post. For what it is worth, the Oracle stock did jump more than 7% before the markets opened that morning. In conclusion, it seems that we live in a world where there is endless tug of war between ethics and profits, and the number of businesses which encompass both seems to be quickly decreasing. Thank you for your time, and good luck everybody with your presentations.